Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fadwa Wazwaz. I've been writing about or speaking about this topic for quite some time now. This is a topic that has really created a lot of controversy and you might say tension around this topic all around. I was thinking about the best way to cover it, and so this is my best attempt, if you will, to discuss the issue of hijab. The title of this talk is Hijab is not about oppression or seduction, it's about trust. And so I want to begin with a little humor, if you will. This is a little a picture that I found on the internet, and I share it sometimes with girls because I think it's important to also lighten up when we're speaking with younger kids. It's normal if we recognize the social pressure that they're facing, particularly in societies where hijab is foreign. And not only is it foreign, but it's perceived as a form of oppression, and it infantilizes, if you will, women. So those who are wearing hijab need to be saved and are oppressed, if you will. So just with a little humor, these is two girls, and one of them is looking to fix her hijab and asking her friend, what do you think of my hijab? Is it me? Do I look cute? Let me fix it a bit. Go on, tell me how do I look? So her friend responded, your arms are showing. And she said, say something encouraging, will you? It just meant to be a little funny humor to help us understand that it's normal for girls as they're learning hijab to recognize the social pressure that they're facing in society, to recognize that they're struggling with giving that social pressure. They want to be sometimes not disobedient, if you will, and I'll discuss that in the next quote, but they want to belong, and they also want to be able to be perceived as presentable and appealing and cute, not be perceived as oppressed or abused or needing to be saved. So it's important to recognize the self-esteem issues that girls might be facing as they're growing up, and to lighten up our discussion on hijab and not make it so difficult, if you will, to embrace. Having said that, I'd like to begin with a quote by a teacher that I like a lot. He's a counselor, actually. And he said in one of his counseling advice that I've been following his advice for quite a long time, that he said, is living Islam versus using Islam against others, excuse me. Living Islam means living, modeling, guiding, teaching, and counseling with loving care and concern. It's a life of trust, struggle, and noble effort. Using Islam often takes the form of holier-than-thou judgmentalism that is used to oppress and keep others in line. It often shows its ugly side through allegations that others are not Islamic or obedient enough. In actuality, the obedience that is demanded is not obedience as a result of taqwa, meaning like consciousness and fear of God, obedience to God, but rather obedience to the tyrant and his own fear-based self. So when Islam becomes objectified in such a manner, the state of inner unity that leads to outer unity, that is peace, and where that is Islam, is used to achieve an objective other than its divinely inherent goal of bringing peace and goodness to people's lives. I've been following this particular counselor since around like 2000, him and Hawa Irfan, and I really liked their counseling advice. They are, I would really recommend people to read their works. They're pretty thorough, and what I found for myself, informative. So how does this deal with hijab? Hijab, which in its essence means to conceal, is usually associated with Muslim women. Although other faith traditions promote modest dress, and Muslim men are also asked to dress modestly. Most of the noise around this world is directed, though, at Muslim women. There are two unhealthy views around Muslim women wearing hijab. First, that a woman who wears hijab is always oppressed. And second, that women must wear hijab because they are necessarily seductresses, and men cannot follow their own conscience unless women are covered. So let's start with hijab and oppression. Some people believe that hijab is always oppression. Certainly they realize that not all women who wear hijab are coerced into doing so. But they say in those cases there are social and family pressures. It's true that humans are always subject to social and family pressures. None of us, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or atheist, was born alone on a desert island. None of us made up our own rules from scratch. All of us were raised in some sort of social system where we were likely subject to both healthy and unhealthy social pressures. Although there are many negative social pressures, there are also many positive ones. We are pressured, for example, socially to recycle. We put on our seatbelts. In fact, there are rules now and laws that says if you don't wear your seatbelt, that you might be penalized, you might get a ticket. Obviously, we can't see someone who's not wearing their seatbelt and go beat them up, or take it upon ourselves to be a police officer and give him a ticket. But if a police officer catches someone not wearing their seatbelt, they may pull him aside and give him a ticket. They can't beat him up, they can't punch them, they can't abuse them. So it's a form of social pressure that led to policies that guide that, might say, a social norm. Eating healthy foods, wear a bike helmet. This is all based on social norms, social pressures that ended up creating policy, giving discussions that this is healthy for the community and society that we live in. All these things are good for us as individuals and for the wider society. There are social norms everywhere. Just because a person adopts a social norm, such as wearing hijab, doesn't necessarily mean they're oppressed, nor does it necessarily mean they're religious. Some women wear hijab, but they don't pray or seek refuge in God. Just because some women wear hijab, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're pious and they're conscious or aware of God while doing so. They could be wearing it for social reasons. They could be wearing it for cultural reasons. But it may not necessarily mean that they're being pious or being conscious and aware of God while wearing hijab. However, there are cases where women are forced hijab, and they might be forced by law, or they might be bullied or shamed into it. They might be attacked, not just by, you might say, law enforcement, but by individuals who take it upon themselves to harm them, compel them, to be more obedient to them. This is oppression. And there are Muslims, both men and women, who speak out against this. They recognize that this does exist. There are cases of this happening, and women should not be forced to wear hijab out of a fear of a tyrant. And I mentioned that quote as an example of people speaking up, that when we do something, we're doing it out of, if you will, obedience to God. We're not doing it obedience to another human being. The same is true, for instance, of marriage. The fact that a woman follows social norms and gets married doesn't mean she's oppressed. But if another person tries to control her and force her into getting married, then that's oppressive. Be free. There is a stereotype about Muslim women that they are constantly also repressed. If they're not oppressed, well, they're repressed. That all the time while we're wearing hijab, deep down in our psychology, if you will, we're just dying to take off the hijab and drink alcohol and eat bacon and go to wild parties and all that sort of stuff. So we're wearing hijab, but it's like there's this inward, I don't want to say even the word struggle, but that we're really desiring these other things that we want to do. So we're not really free, we're oppressed, but we're repressed. And while this might be true of some, and it's certainly not a struggle for everyone. And some might simply want to adhere to a healthy lifestyle. Simply because one can do something doesn't necessarily make it a healthy lifestyle. And we also need to consider the consequences for ourselves and others. While there are voices within the Muslim community pressuring women to wear hijab, there are also people within the Muslim community forcing women to take it off. In both cases, this is an issue of abusive control. And so I know of cases, for example, of men, Arab men, raised in the Middle East, that did not want their spouses to wear hijab. And when they chose their spouses freely on their own to wear hijab, not just in the Middle East, but even here in the West, they took it off the hijab, off of their spouse's head. This is Muslim men we're talking about. So we're not just speaking about France, in areas of France where they're being pressured by law not to wear. There's a ban on hijab and a ban on the burqa, or the burkini, in swimming pools. But sometimes the stereotypes that we create make it difficult to have that conversation. Sometimes within the very same Muslim community, in the Muslim societies, in the Muslim communities themselves, there are people being forced not to wear hijab. I have relatives where the woman did not wear hijab because her husband pressured her not to wear hijab. She was not allowed to wear hijab. He was embarrassed to be seen with her wearing hijab, and he would take it off of her. So these are not isolated cases. It's not one or two or three, and we're generalizing. There are as many cases as there are, you might see, of women being forced to wear hijab. The issue here, though, is not hijab. The issue here is abusive control of another human being to make them submissive to your desire or your needs. So the third thing I would like to discuss is seduction, temptation, and covering. Some men believe women should wear hijab because they are inherently temptresses. But women should not need to feel responsible for the irresponsible behavior of men. If a man should harass a woman, then that responsibility falls entirely with him, whether a woman is wearing a winter coat or a bikini. Women are not required to change themselves to fix men's behavior. If men need help controlling themselves, then they should seek help. And a lot of times when you call this out, people assume that you're promoting promiscuity or you're trying to violate Islamic law. But the truth is, the verses on hijab begin with asking men to lower their gaze. So if your gaze is lowered and you're not lusting after a woman that's not permissible for you, whether a woman is wearing a winter coat or a bikini, you would not notice it because you're not aware of her. You're aware of God's presence and you're aware of your duty and you're living Islam. You're not acting like a tyrant trying to make someone submissive to you. So men who are lowering their gaze cannot really see if a woman is wearing a winter coat or a bikini. And if they sense that, whatever appears like her legs or something, they would take the necessary responsibility and remove themselves. Women are not required to change themselves to fix men's behavior. If men need help controlling themselves, then they should seek help. There is a saying by Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace and blessings, that says that one of the trials for men, I'm just paraphrasing here, being brief, is women. Now, some people take that hadith, or you might say saying of Prophet Muhammad, and therefore they justify and say that women are seductresses and temptresses because of that saying of Prophet Muhammad. That's one way to look at it. Another way is to say that that's an area of weakness for you, the men. That one of your areas of weakness is you might desire women that are not permissible for you. You might be lusting, you might lust after them. And just like I showed with the little girls who want to be cute, who want to be pretty, we want to help them to recognize that that's feelings. It's important for men to believe what Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, said, that you have an area of weakness. And instead of trying to reduce women to a seductress or a temptress, it's important to recognize that you also have an area of weakness within you, and to work as men together and acknowledge that area of weakness instead of projecting your issues onto others, and to work on seeking help to deal with that area of weakness. It's not something you can ignore. It's not something you can pretend not to have as a struggle. You must recognize that is an area of weakness that you have. The Prophet said that is an area of weakness that men have. And you must show to yourself and to others that you really are consciously working on fixing that area of weakness or taking necessary steps that you need to take to deal with that area of weakness. So we don't wear hijab, or I don't wear hijab, because I feel like I'm admitting to the world that I'm a seductress and I'm a temptress. That's not why I wear hijab. I just want to make sure that that is out there, so that, because some people feel that when you're wearing hijab, you're admitting to others that you do it because you're a temptress and you're a seductress, and that's why I'm wearing hijab. So then why do women wear hijab? Sometimes we come up with very good reasons and human understandings of things, and they may be true, they may be limited in their understanding, or they may be totally just, like I gave that example of seductress, our own way of projecting our own issues onto others. Let me give you an example. Sometimes for example, we fast during the month of Ramadan. Muslims fast, I should say. For instance, some say we fast so that we can feel empathy with those who are hungry. And I've heard that a lot, and I've said it myself before. I was corrected by, I was listening to Imam Sharawi in one of his lectures. While fasting might spark empathy for some, that's not why we fast. We fast because it's a commandment from God. We fast because we're showing our trust in God. We trust that God is all-knowing and He commanded us to fast. But it's also important to note that God told Muslims to fast. The only people that are excused from fasting are not the poor. For example, if we fast because we want to feel empathy with the poor, for example, the poor are also asked to fast. Those are exempt from fasting are those who are, for example, pregnant, if it's going to be a health concern, and people who have, you might say, health concerns that make it difficult for them to fast. So if you fast, and that fasting is going to, like if you're a diabetic, my mom used to fast all the time, and it's going to cause you to be sick, then you might be excused from fasting. Whether you're rich or poor has nothing to do with it. So ultimately, as Imam Sharawi said, we fast because we know God is all-knowing and He commanded us to fast. We try to come up with our own understanding to help us sometimes to fast. But ultimately, we really fast because we recognize God is all-knowing and we trust His wisdom, and when He commands us for something, we trust that He does it for our own benefit, and we fast. Hijab is the same way. We might not know why God has commanded us to wear hijab, and we don't really need to know the full details. And so the discussion on hijab from a Muslim perspective should not be whether a woman is a seductress or not, whether a woman is oppressed or not, whether was there's social pressure regarding her wearing hijab and family pressure or not, if she's oppressed or not. The question that drives hijab should be, is this a commandment from God or not? Because we will face all of these hurdles when we wear hijab. We will face those who will pressure us to wear it. We will face those who will pressure us not to wear it. On that journey, we will face people who will bully us to wear it, and they'll attack us if we're not wearing it according to how they want us to wear it. We will face people in that same journey who want it, like I said, to take it off, but then those who want to reduce us that we wear it because we're admitting that we're seductresses and temptresses, and that might shake us, that might crush us. And I have seen people who took it off because of one of those struggles that they had faced, or one of those hurdles or obstacles in their way. But we have to remind ourselves and remind these individuals, we should continue to remind ourselves that we wear it because God is all-knowing and it's a commandment from God. And I recall the story of Hajar, the wife of Prophet Abraham, upon him peace. It doesn't make sense that God asked her, or asked Prophet Abraham to put her and her son in the desert. Now, obviously, if someone tells you to go to the desert, you're not a prophet, and there is no prophet after Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings come from an Islamic tradition. But her question, and this teaches us, as for me as a Muslim woman, and I ask others to look at this, to look at it the same way. Her perception was, is this a command from God? If one looks at it, it doesn't make sense for a woman with a child to be in the desert all alone without any help or any means of support. But what drove the question is not, she didn't here try to interpret it based on her limited human capabilities or limited human knowledge. What she asked Prophet Abraham, upon him peace, is this a command from God? And he said yes. So the reason she accepted to be in the desert was she recognized that God had commanded her to be there, and he's the all-knowing, and it was following the commandment based on trusting God, the all-knowing. So hijab is in that same way. What should drive the questions is this a command from God? And if so, if it is a command from God, how others interpret it or misinterpret it, perceive it or misperceive it should really be acknowledged, recognized, but then taken out of the conversation and pushed aside. Yeah, we acknowledge all of these issues, but they're not part of the conversation. So we should just take them and say, okay, now that we've acknowledged you, we've addressed you, we need to put you aside because you're not part of the conversation. The conversation should be, is this a command from God? How was it implemented? And how was it applied? And that's really where the conversation should begin and should be, you might say, the scope around the conversation should be around right there. Now, when we walk around with that understanding of we wore hijab for God, what I feel also is it teaches us not to look down on others who are struggling. You can kind of tell because people, you probably have struggled with all those issues that I've talked about, or those who don't wear it. Nor are we meant to feel superior to those, like I said, who don't wear it. And to recognize that ultimately, when you're wearing the hijab, it's a command for God, what you're really doing by any act of worship, or following any command, whether it's prayer, wearing hijab, fasting, giving charity, you're really just building your relationship with God. So your whole focus should be on God, and your whole emphasis should be on being obedient for God. So you're here building your relationship with God. You're not really concerned about all the other issues of why people wear it or don't wear it and how they feel and how they perceive it. You're really wearing, and you're telling yourself and you're reminding yourself, I'm doing this for you. So it helps even when you're starting the journey of following any command, that you have sometimes that conversation with God and say, I'm doing this for you, or to ask God to give you the grace and to be sincere that you're doing this for him, and to keep reminding him to give you the strength and to strengthen you that I'm going to follow this command, but I could do it by you and with you, and I want to do it for you. So ask him for that help, and ask him for that strength, and ask him for that grace. And I find if you have that conversation, then he will help you on that journey to building a better relationship with him. I'd like to end with the verses on hijab from the Quran, if I may. It says, if I could just begin here, it's in the chapter An-Nur, or the light in English. It says, Allah commands Prophet Muhammad as follows. It begins with, again, telling men not telling women, but telling men. Say to the believing men that they should cast down their glances and guard their private parts by being chaste, that this is better for them. This is a command to Muslim men, that they should not lustfully look at women other than their own wives, in order to prevent any possibility of temptation. They're required to cast their glances downwards. This is known as hijab of the eyes. So there's the one that covers your hair, but there's also the hijab of the eyes, that you should be lowering your eyes the same way like you're covering, so that you can not be distracted by all the distractions out there, not just women, and focus on God. So the whole emphasis here is, again, telling men first and foremost to lower their gaze. So now if they're lowering their gaze, they're not going to be noticing that the woman who's a seductress or a temptress. So if they notice her, then they did not fulfill the command of God. In the next verse, God commands the prophet to address women and say to the believing women that they should cast down their glances and guard their private parts by being chaste. And then he goes further into that they should cover, which is like what you see me here, covering their hair. So let me just give it to you from the Quran itself. And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and be mindful of their chastity, to not display their charms in public beyond what may decently be apparent thereof. Hence, let them draw their head coverings over their bosoms, and let them not display more of their charms to any but their husbands. So then it gives a list of people that they can take their hijab off, you might say, like their father, their brothers, some men that basically you cannot marry, if you will, or men that don't have sexual desires, like young children, or individuals who have reached the age of where there isn't sexual desire for the opposite gender. But ultimately, it becomes a form of, like I say, a cultural or social norm, even within Islamic, that women should dress modestly. Having said that, sometimes, whether it's a man or a woman, they breach that lowering the gaze. And what you find is that, as Jesus, upon him peace, said, you have heard that it was said by them of old time, you shall not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whoever looks on a woman to lust after her. Now again, here is you're looking, because sometimes there's some cultural programming, like in the United States, you're taught, if you don't look at somebody, make eye contact, it means you're hiding something. You're being deceptive. You're being dishonest. You lack confidence. So a lot of the, if you will, powerful presentations recently said you have to make eye contact. Or a lot of the presentations that you've done over the years, like with work, even like with electronic data systems, they took us on a professional, getting us like the social norm of their organization was you have to make eye contact, because it's perceived as if you don't make eye contact that you're dishonest and you're not a good employee. But here it is said that, again, you're looking at somebody and you're lusting after that person. And so whoever looks on a woman to lust after has committed adultery with her already in his heart. So if you see a Muslim casting his or her eyes downward when he or she is talking to a member of the opposite sex, this shouldn't be considered as rude or an indication of lack of confidence or that they're being deceptive or dishonest. It could be that they're just abiding by the Quranic as well as the biblical teaching. It's important as we discuss this particular issue, though, to acknowledge that just because somebody also is lowering their gaze doesn't necessarily mean that they're not lusting after the opposite gender. Sometimes individuals will be lowering their gaze, but then behind the scenes, they're really lusting after somebody who they're not married to. And you see it in both men or women. Sometimes they'll be both dressed super duper pious, even covering their faces for women. And yet behind the scenes, they're trying to get very close to somebody who they're not married to, with the intention to destroy their marriage and then to marry them. And I've seen that happen quite a few times, and people don't like it when you call that out. And sometimes some individuals may themselves have engaged in those practices. And if you will, even though they're dressed from head to toe and they destroyed someone's marriage, what happens as a result of their engagement and their behavior is not only have they destroyed someone's marriage, but they'll see anyone that's just saying hello to their spouse as though they are going to do what they have done. So if an example of that would be, if you knew somebody was married and you got very close to him and you married him and you destroyed his marriage, and then you'll see another woman and you'll think that the intentions you had when you were communicating with that individual is the same intentions that another woman has when she says hello or she takes a class with the individual. So that leaves an impact on the heart. When you don't engage in hijab for God, you might convince people of your piety and you might convince people of your virtue, but it leaves an impact on the heart. And that impact will end up impacting how you interact and you engage with others. And it will come out through projection. Because it left an impact on your heart, you didn't repent for it, you will start to see others in that light. An example of that would be, if I'm not wearing hijab for God, or as an act of trust, if you will, because I trust God's command, then I will start to look down at those who don't wear hijab. It will leave an impact on my heart. When I see somebody who's not wearing it, I'll feel like I'm superior. If I see a woman, for example, who's non-Muslim, I'll start to think, and a lot of times we see it, by the way, I'll start to feel like she might say, you're oppressed, and I might think like, oh, you're a sex object. And I might start to even have those feelings of that I'm more superior, I'm more pious than that person. That's usually the feelings that comes out, the thought processes, if you're not doing it for God. And if you're doing it to impress or to belong into a particular group, you might think that somebody's not doing it exactly the way you're doing it. So you might start to attack those individuals as well. If you're lowering your gaze, but you're not lowering it for God, then you'll be noticing all the people that are not lowering it, or instead of being aware of God. So you're not literally, if you will, I go back to the quote above, you're not living Islam. You're really using Islam, an outward show of piety, against others. You're not living, you're not modeling, you're not guiding or teaching with loving care and concern. You're not acknowledging your areas of weakness, whether you're a woman or you're a man, and owning up to it and struggling with it and calling yourself out. You're not trying to build that trust with God and with noble effort. So what instead happens is you have this holier than thou judgmentalism, where you start to monitor others if they're not Islamic or obedient enough, so that you can sort of keep them in line, and or attack them if you feel like they may be guilty of what you have done, or they may do what you have done. So it's very important for us to keep that in mind, so that when we are promoting, or we're doing like promoting a social norm of wearing hijab for God, that we acknowledge all of these issues that I have addressed, and that we try as best as we can to promote hijab as an act of faith, trusting God, the all-knowing, and trusting His knowledge over us. I want to end by reading a section, if you will, by one of the books that I use about the most beautiful names of God. And in this chapter that I just mentioned, that hijab is mentioned over and over again. The chapter references, if you will, talks about the name of God, Al-Alim, or the All-Knowing. So throughout the chapter, it's mentioned over and over and over again, Al-Alim, Al-Alim. So it's nonstop mentioned that God, the All-Knowing, if you will. So what does that mean if we can just read this along? And this is just my own interpretation, so it's limited, but why I like us to focus on the beautiful names of God. He's the one who knows all. He knows what has happened, what is happening, what will happen from the beginning to the end. All existence is present at all times in the knowledge of Al-Alim. Nothing can be left out. No one can hide himself. All existence exists by his creation within the limitations of the conditions that he has created. It knows as much as God has permitted it to know. Yet there is no limit to God's knowledge. Comparison to what one knows of this creation, what one does not know is infinite. The world of ours is like our very own house. For these millions of years, we have inhabited it, yet we still do not know what is hidden in the closets and in the attic and in the basement. And I'd like to just stop here. A lot of times, and I mentioned this others, is sometimes what God wants us to understand or to discover, if you will, by some commands that he places, is our strengths, is our certain gifts, talents that we might have. And this hijab, and this is again my own interpretation, helps us to go inward. It helps us to discover that inward talent, that inward strength, that inward gifts that we have. Because at times as women, the social pressure is such that we're always asked to perform, and we're always asked to obsess with our image, if you will. It makes it difficult for us to reflect and to have a moment where we really are just looking inward. And if you will, to look into what is hidden in the closets, in the attic, in the basements of ourselves. Sometimes we're like someone who's dying of hunger, who has a treasure buried a foot under him. So maybe there's this treasure within us that God wants us to discover. Our knowledge stays on the surface of a very few things. When we attempt to look under the surface, we see our impotence. What about the future? We don't know what's going to happen to us the next moment. What is this human life in comparison to the infinite past or infinite future? It's a blink of an eye. How much can one see? Happy is he who can see that he cannot see. And that's where trust really comes in, that we recognize this is a word from God, a command from God. We don't have the full details of why God is asking us to wear hijab, but we're willing to look inward and to discover all sorts of blessings and gifts that we might find within. Indeed, God bestows upon all sorts of blessings, perfections commensurate to you. He taught you his names, what is right and what is wrong, but your life is limited. Your power is limited. Your knowledge is limited. You're limited. Try to feel the unlimited perfection, if you will, the unlimited knowledge of God, knower of all, and seek his pleasure. Eternal salvation is contained within all that. So to end on this, somebody who's working on wearing hijab by building a trust with God, it helps to somehow refer to understanding this beautiful name of God and not obsess with all the permutations of misconceptions and misperceptions of hijab. He was given wisdom without learning anything from anyone, without studying or thinking, only due to the purity and the light with which he was created. And this is like somebody who has created that level of trust with God. It's called irfan, type of knowledge. So they're worried more about having a pure heart, because the more your heart is pure, the more you're able to receive the spiritual light that God is constantly showering upon you. This is like the truth, is seeing the truth as the truth. So I encourage myself, and I encourage everybody who's taking on the struggle or taking on the task to wear hijab as an act of faith, trust in God, to study the name of Al-Alim while doing so, and to keep reminding themselves of this name, and of this name as they're going on that journey of wearing the hijab. Or it could be any command of God, to recognize, not to try to limit God's knowledge or wisdom behind the command, but to try to purify one's heart of why they're doing or engaging in this command. As the more you purify your heart, the more that you start to go down the road of living Islam instead of using Islam against others. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and it was beneficial. And if it is beneficial and you did enjoy it, I hope that you can share it with others, that they will benefit as well. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.